If you're not already familiar with this game, this is a really popular auction bidding game from the designer Ratzia, who is just really good at creating a lot of popular games. And I guess because of that, it's not a huge surprise that this one is our Discord pick of the week, but it's also my own personal pick of the week as well. But before I jump into how exactly Raw plays, I first want to mention that this new campaign here is going to be introducing a brand new expansion called Raw Traders. It's going to be adding a brand new tile into the game as well as a few other components, but the way that this tile works is that if you're able to gain it, it will be worth a victory point, but also anytime that you gain another one of those tiles or anytime anyone at the table gains another one of those tiles, you'll be able to add a goods token to that tile, with each of those goods tokens also being worth a victory point. The catch here is that both the tiles and the goods are going to be scored and removed from play at the end of the round, which means that these could be very valuable to invest in if a lot of them do come up in the round, but it could be a little bit of a gamble since that may not always happen that way. Of course, if you're not already familiar with the base game, this might not make a whole lot of sense just yet, so what I'll do is go ahead and roll my previous coverage of Raw explaining how the game plays if you do want to learn more about the game. But then I'll also jump back and explain the other two games here, which is Ratzia as well as Raw and Right. So if you do already know how to play Raw and you don't want to see a whole run through of how that works, you can just jump ahead to those other two games if you do want to learn about them. But if you're not familiar with how this game plays, you're essentially trying to collect different tiles in order to score victory points by collecting different sets, because all the tiles score in different ways, and you're going to be slotting those into the different areas on your personal player board in order to track the tiles that you've collected and hopefully score the most victory points at the end of 3 rounds. But I did mention that there is a lot of variety in the tiles, and not all of them help you score victory points. Instead, some can give you some special actions or abilities, while others can actually cause disasters and cause you to lose tiles. But on a player's turn, they can take one of 3 actions. They can either draw a tile from the bag and then put it in the shared display here, or instead they can use a god tile if they have one in their possession to just take a tile from the display if there's a tile out there that they really want. Or you can trigger an auction, which allows all the players to either bid or pass on everything that you can see on the shared display, including this token in the middle, which I will get to in a second. Whenever there's an auction in this game, players will each be able to put in their bids starting from the player to the left of the player who initiated the auction, and then you're going to be essentially choosing one of the available tiles from the center of your board of different values, and each player will be able to put one of those out as their bid, and the player who put out the highest value after all players have either passed or bid will get everything in the shared display. This can happen at any time, so the board may not be as full as you see it now, which means that a lot of players might pass if there's nothing there that they really want. But for the player that did win the auction, they're going to be swapping the bid token that they used to win the auction with the one that is out on display. So they're going to be taking that one that's out on display and putting it on their own personal board face down, indicating that they've used one of their tokens, and their token is now out on display, and whoever wins the next auction will get the one that they put out there. So the different bid tokens will be getting passed from player to player, so you'll always want to keep in mind that whatever you are bidding, you are potentially giving an opportunity for another player to have that in a following round, because when it comes back to your board, it goes face down, and it doesn't get flipped back up until all players' tokens are face down, and then that triggers the start of the next round, and all of those get flipped back up. Since there's so much variety in the tiles, victory points can be triggered at different points in the game depending on the tiles that you've collected, but at the end of the 3rd round, players are going to be comparing their overall victory points that they've gained to that moment, and then the player with the most victory points is going to win the game. The simplest way to describe Ratzia is that it's essentially a card version of the game Raw, and at the start of the game, each player is going to have a few different bidding cards that they'll be able to use in the various auctions throughout the game. Then there's also going to be a deck of cards that players are going to be drawing from rather than a bag of tiles. On your turn, you have 3 different options to choose from, with the first one being to, of course, draw from that deck of cards and then add whatever card that you drew onto the end of the bidding row. The bidding row is going to be below the deck of cards, and each time a player draws a card, it's going to be added to that row, increasing its size and increasing its value, unless, of course, someone draws a police card, which is then going to be forcing an auction. When an auction occurs, each player is going to have the option to submit one of their bidding cards into the auction, with a player who submits the highest value winning the auction. Then they'll be taking all those cards from the row into their supply in order to create sets, which will score them victory points at the end of the game. Then they're also going to be swapping the card that they bid with with the one that's currently out on display. That one's going to come back to you face down, meaning that you won't be able to use it until a following round. One of the other actions you could perform rather than just drawing a card from the deck and adding it to the auction row is to just simply declare an auction. You might want to do this for a variety of reasons. Either there's cards there that you really want and you want to try and buy those before it gets too valuable to someone else, or maybe there's cards there that you don't want and you're hoping that other players will bid on them and reduce the amount of bidding cards that they have access to, making future auctions a little bit more in your favor. But one of the other reasons that you might want to do this is if you have any auction cards left and the round is nearly coming to an end, because once 7 police cards are drawn, that's going to be forcing the end of the round, and if you have any auction cards left, that doesn't matter. You're not going to be able to use them for any other auctions that round, and you're just instantly moving into the next round. But there is also another special card that you do want to be aware of, and those are the Thieves cards. And if you are able to acquire those by buying a row that has a Thief card in it, you can actually use an action in a future turn in order to spend that card, in order to take any other card you want from the bidding row or from another player. The game continues like this over the 3 rounds, and then the player with the most victory points at the end wins the game. And then we have Raw and Write, which is the most different of the games. And this one is, of course, going to involve writing on a sheet like most roll and writes, but this one is actually a draw and write, which means that you're actually going to be using cards in order to determine the actions that you have available, and whichever card that you choose, you're going to be taking that associated action. The deck also has 9 different raw cards in it, and anytime that 3 of those cards are drawn, that's going to be triggering the end of the round, and since there's 9 cards, there is, of course, 3 rounds in this game. This is a game that plays over a series of turns, and on your turn, you're just going to be drawing 3 cards from the deck and then revealing them out on the table. Then you're going to be choosing one of those cards to take your action with. Whichever card you choose is going to be discarded from those 3 cards, leaving just 2 for all the other players. Each player can choose which of those 2 they want to use. They don't get discarded, so multiple players can choose the same card. But essentially, each of these cards are going to allow you to fill in some area of your sheet. There are a bunch of different sections here. The top section is broken into 3 different spaces, each one representing a different round, because each of those boxes are going to be scoring at the end of that specific round. When you draw the card that allows you to use that section, it's also going to have a number associated with it, and you'll be able to put that number into one of the boxes, and the player that has the highest value whenever that scores is going to be getting the most amount of victory points. The third section works very similar to the first one, except for in this one, all the numbers do need to be in sequential order. So depending on what numbers you get at which point in the game, you're going to have to anticipate where you think you can place those so that you're not locking yourself out of placements in the future. The next 2 sections are broken into rows and columns, but they work very different from each other, and you're going to have access to this first one anytime that you activate a card with any of these symbols on them. That's going to allow you to fill in one of the spaces in that associated column, but it's up to the player to decide which space they want to fill. Each row represents the different rounds in the game, and these are going to be scoring at the end of those rounds, and the more of these that you have filled in, the more points you're going to gain. Final section works a little simpler, where you're just going to be filling in the different columns depending on which monument is on the card that you chose. And then if you're able to fill up a column, then that's going to be scoring you victory points according to that column. Or if you fill in a row, that is another way that you can gain some bonuses. But one thing that I really like about this game is that even though this version doesn't feature the bidding like the other raw games, this one does incorporate a little bit more push your luck. This is because each of the sections can also grant you with negative victory points if you're the furthest behind, or if you just didn't invest enough into that section. Since each round ends when 3 raw cards are drawn, that essentially means that you don't know the length that the round is actually going to be. Of course, once 2 are drawn, you can start anticipating that it's probably going to end pretty soon, but you're going to want to meet those minimum requirements for each round before each round ends, but it is up to you to decide how much you want to push that off. But the player with the most victory points at the end of those 3 rounds wins the game, and if you do want to check out any of these games, you can go ahead and find a link to the campaign in the description down below.